Well, I'm really very cheered and very excited about the emergence of Occupy. And the reason is that I think it's going to be a big movement. It's going to be a movement that lasts a while, maybe a decade. And movements have been the main, protest movements have been the main humanizing force in American history from the very beginning of our history. The reason that we have what elements we do have of an electoral representative democracy is because the American Revolutionary War was partly a protest movement from the bottom. And it was the fervor and strength of that protest movement and the fact that American elites needed the support of the dirt farmers and the artisans who were in that protest movement. That's the reason, well, it's the reason that the Revolutionary War was won, but it's also the reason that the state constitutions formed during the Revolution, and even the federal government that was created by the founding fathers, that both had some elements of democracy in them. And the ideas of these radical Democrats, they were a little like Occupy, really. They didn't trust representation. They didn't trust a national government that was far removed from their towns and their farms. They had much more trust in the state legislature, particularly if the legislature had to be elected every year. They wanted to keep calling them back to be accountable, and they wanted also to be able to watch what they were doing. Well, those ideas of the radical Democrats at the beginnings of the American nation were, of course, swamped by the decades and then centuries of efforts by American elites to limit the voice of people at the bottom. Direct democracy was not for them. But still, something remained of the efforts, the ardor of the radical Democrats who did the actual fighting in the Revolutionary War. Or then again, beginning in the 1830s, another great movement emerged. It emerged slowly. We call it the abolitionists. The abolitionists were very religious, very determined, very brave. They were white in the North, but many blacks joined the abolitionists. The abolitionists ran, for example, what was called the Underground Railway, which drained slaves from the South. Now, from the perspective of the South, to provide a conduit through which their property could escape was treacherous. And it was the continued provocations of the abolitionists that were responsible for the secession of the slave states. And that in turn led to the Revolutionary War. And it led also to the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which not only freed the slaves, but gave us the rights that are now embodied in the 14th Amendment, and also gave the slaves, or the former slaves, the right to vote. These amendments were called at the time the New Birth of Freedom. But of course the New Birth of Freedom, as you know, didn't last. It was overtaken swamped once the war was over and the abolitionist movement faded. It was overtaken and swamped by the propertied interests in the South. Now, not the old plantation owners, but also a lot of northern money that came into the South and bought those plantations and ran them not with slaves, but with serfs, with the tenant farmers, day laborers, who had to be emancipated again by the civil rights movement. And then there was the populist movement. This was a movement of farmers, smaller farmers, not subsistence farmers necessarily. Many of them sent their livestock and their grain to market, but they sent their livestock and grain to market on the railroads because they had been, in a way, enticed to establish farms far out across the continent by the railroads themselves. These big financial guys in the East built the railroads. They built too many railroads, responsible for a lot of instability, economic instability in the late 19th century. And then they induced people to come and establish farms along the railroads. But those farmers were dependent on the railroads. And the railroads charged the highest rates they could get. The farmers were hard pressed. They also owed money. Farmers always owe money. They have to borrow money till their next crop. And that made the banks and the railroads the enemy of the populist movement that arose in the late 19th century. The populists didn't win. They took an electoral path. They formed a coalition with the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party was defeated in a very important election in 1896. So much of what the populists imagined, which was, widespread cooperatives and a national bank to give them credit so that they wouldn't become anchored to the banks and to the lien merchants who sucked up their farms when they fell into debt. Much of what they imagined, aspired to, dreamt of, they did not get until maybe the 1930s. But the populist ideas of reform and the tremendous insurgency that the populists inspired did influence the progressive legislation early in the century. The next great movement in American history was the labor movement. And there has been labor insurgency, labor strikes, bitter, brutal strikes in the United States throughout the second half of the 19th century and the first few decades of the 20th century. Working people who were sucked into the maws of the industrial machine, who were sucked into the mines and the mills, were horrified by the new industrial system, and especially horrified by the great mammoth industrial empires that were being created. And they protested the conditions of their labor. They protested the size and scale of the industrial empires created by the robber barons. They protested in the Great Strike of 1877, known as the Grand Army of Starvation, where the workers on the Pennsylvania Railroad rose up against the railroad, turned over the railroad cars, burned down the roundhouses, the Pennsylvania Railroad succeeded in getting the governors to call out the militia against the strikers, but in many places the militia refused to strike against the workers. It was a very tense moment in American history. The railroad workers, though, did not win. There were more mass strikes in the 1880s, partly because of recurrent crashes in the economy caused by the overbuilding of the railroads, which were the big business of the country. And in 1886, the famous Haymarket riot, which gave the world May Day to honor the Haymarket martyrs. But of course, in the United States, we don't celebrate May Day, we celebrate Labor Day on September 1. And the Great Pullman Strike of 1886, terrible strikes, terrible in the sense that blood was lost, people were killed, many arrests, and at each juncture, when labor rose up, the American government, the state, they call it in political science tracts, the American state acted against the workers and in the interests of the robber barons, usually by issuing injunctions, hundreds of injunctions against labor combination. A union was an illegal combination under the court ruled under the anti-monopoly legislation that had been passed by the Congress in response really to the populist movement. Or the ideas of property that were promulgated by the court were ideas introduced via English common law. You know, there's no right to property in the American Constitution. So the courts drew on the common law of England, and they drew on the common law of England to rule that the right to property not only was the right to own and use something, but was the right to own and use something to increase wealth. And that meant the right of property became a right over labor or over anyone who tried to stop the use of property with a strike, for example. So we have really a fantastically ugly history of court rulings against labor, and that did not change until the labor movement, in a sense, matured and grew larger, and here's an important point, a point for our own time, and until labor also acquired some electoral support, because the great labor victories were the victories of mass strikes in the 1930s, but they were the victories of mass strikes in the context of an electoral regime which depended on working class voters, which made FDR, it's absolutely impossible for FDR, well, impossible even for Hoover in 1932 to veto the Norris-LaGuardia Act, which declared yellow dog contracts unconstitutional. A yellow dog contract was a typical condition of employment in a factory or a mine where the prospective employee had to sign away the right to walk out, which meant the sign away reflected the disruptive force of the movement in the South of the United States particularly. The Montgomery bus boycott shut down business in Montgomery. The Birmingham demonstrations did the same thing. So here's the point. Made notes. Here's my point. I think that protest movements have been the major force periodically humanizing aspects of American society. Movements subside. They subside because they win things. Part of what they win is intended to quiet the movement. And when the movement subsides, at least a part of what they win is eaten away, taken back. But not necessarily altogether lost. We're better off for having at least some elements of electoral representative democracy. African Americans in this country wanted to be free men. They wanted to overthrow chattel slavery, which was the main accomplishment of the Civil War, even though elements of chattel slavery were reintroduced through the serfdom that was practiced by the plantation South. The workers who struck in Akron and Flint, or in San Francisco before that, they wanted the right to unionize. And it made a big difference in their lives, at least for 50 years. It meant that people who were treated like scum, the rubber workers, many of whom came from the Appalachians, they were Okies, with unionization, they had a steady wage, the wages rose, they could buy a ticky-tacky house, an RV vehicle. They wanted those things. Those things made them, gave them self-respect, as did the fact that they could grieve conditions in the workplace. They were not simply arbitrarily at the mercy of a foreman. Unionization made a difference. And then as the movement subsided, the unionization was pushed back. In the 1960s, a third of American workers, or 30% of American workers, were union members. Now in the private sector, it's 6.9%. It's more in the public sector, but public sector unions are under fire now, and in any case, most public sector unions are legally prohibited from striking, which changes the character of a union. So, I nevertheless maintain that these protest movements were historically very important and that they accomplished changes in American society that were worth accomplishing. Protest movements, we know something about why they arise that may illuminate why I think, and I think you think, we are at the cusp of a new protest movement. Protest movements arise, I think, out of two kinds of conditions. One is hardship, disappointment, things, unemployed people, wage cuts, or being driven off the farm. But it's not just hardship, because in the history of humankind, people have often endured famines. They just lay down and die. That happens. So it's hardship, but it's also conditions which lead people to imagine that they can reverse those hardships. What gives them that inspiration? Well, It may be that some of the rhetoric of elites gives them that inspiration. It may be that ambitious politicians trying to tap the votes of those who are afflicted by hardship assert that this shouldn't be happening, that people have rights. Or it may be that people find it somehow in their culture or in their imagination to themselves decide that they have rights. But it's this combination of hardship and the delegitimation of the conditions which create the hardship. And I think both those conditions are present in American society today. People are losing much of what they worked hard for, the little bits of wealth that they accumulated in their homes. Many, many people are unemployed. Their wages have failed to keep up with inflation or have been cut outright. The social safety net has been chipped away. This on the one hand, and on the other hand we have, well, the rhetoric of an Obama in 2008, we are the ones we've been waiting for. But also the exposure of the manipulation and criminality by the banks, by Wall Street, by the mortgage companies, intermediaries. Those are conditions which help people to see that the conditions under which they live are not legitimate and maybe they can do something about them. Well, but we waited for it to happen, and it didn't happen. I mean, a lot of people thought right after the financial crash and after the huge bailouts of the banks and after the Barack Obama campaign and its lofty populist rhetoric, we should have a movement now. And we waited. And we waited. Well, you know, they had to wait in 1929 too. The crash occurred in 29. And for a long time, there were some protests, but there are some protests now, or 6 months ago. There were some protests, there were some rent riots, there were some food riots in 1930, 31, but mostly not much happened. In 1932, the New Yorker magazine wrote an editorial saying, well, we thought there was going to be a revolution, but now we've gone back to cultivating our vegetable garden. And then the protests erupted. The end of 33, 34, 35, 36, 37. So you gotta give people time. But I also think that there's an element of daring and imagination in protest that, you know, we can't quite get our minds around. People say, well, then the spark was struck. Well, that's a metaphor that says I don't understand what happened. And Occupy was like that. You know, we didn't even know Occupy was the spark at the beginning. The press laughed at Occupy. You know, they don't have any demands and they dress funny and but Occupy was imaginative. They had a great slogan. We are the 99%. They had the imagination to think that they could make Zuccotti Park Wall Street. It wasn't. It was just close. And they never occupied Wall Street, but Occupy Wall Street, what an idea. And so it resonated, and then the occupations spread. Other people got the idea. Occupy McPherson Square, occupy Oakland, occupy everywhere, and maybe on President's Day, occupy Wichita, the home of the Koch brothers. That would be nice. So, and then there was this absurd and fortuitous event, the video of the police officer pepper spraying, deliberately going up and going, psh, that helped. A lot of things seemed to help that under somewhat different circumstances might have worked against the protests. And then they had the goodwill and the imagination to ask the unions to come and march down to Zuccotti Park, to reach out to the unions. That was very smart. And Occupy became an international slogan, and the occupation became an international tactic and became international sign language. But I think that was great, and it's already accomplished a great deal, more than the left has been able to accomplish in 30 years, because it's put the issue of extreme inequality and the predatory behavior of Wall Street in the spotlight. It's on the political agenda. It's not going to get ignored in the 2012 election. They penetrated the fog of propaganda. That was an accomplishment. So, but movements do something else. Movements are the people's propaganda. Because we don't have press, we don't have cable news. We have the streets and the banners and the songs and the slogans. That's how we try to communicate. And that's what Occupy has done, and done well. But movements don't win just through propaganda. Propaganda can evaporate. Movements win because they are disruptive, because they threaten the operation of major institutions in the society. It's because partly it's the propaganda that does this, but somehow people find the anger and the courage and the hope, which leads them to withdraw their cooperation, which is necessary for the operation of major institutions. So, and when they do that, movements have still another effect. Not only do they bring the factories to a halt or close down the schools, they also cause ruptures, fragmentation in political coalitions. They polarize political coalitions, so they have an effect on electoral politics as well. And that's important as we look forward to the 2012 election, because a lot of people are going to say, well, we understand that the movement is important, but now the election is more important because we really don't want Mitt Romney to be president, or God forbid, Newt Gingrich to be president. And I don't want Mitt Romney to be president or Newt Gingrich either. And I don't want the Tea Party to continue. Also affect electoral politics, because the protests, A, powerfully communicate issues, and B, cause stoppages, disruptions in institutional life that have to be remedied, that have to be healed. And so I think that maybe we should look at right now as a second phase of what I think will be a great protest movement, going way beyond the squares and parks that were occupied in the fall. A protest movement that reaches out into the neighborhoods, into the workplaces, into the schools. I think that is beginning to happen. I think that when student groups meet about tuition, they call general assemblies, don't they? In every campus. And they do this and they do this. They've joined Occupy, and Occupy has joined them. I noticed that the International Longshoremen's Union, at first very nervous about Occupy's participation in their fight against this big granary owned by multinationals on the West Coast, has recently put out statements proclaiming their firm alliance with Occupy. Occupy has to help the unions. Occupy should be in the foreclosure fight. Occupy should mean occupying houses that have been foreclosed. Occupy should mean occupying the schools. Every big university campus should have an occupation. Now, why do I want an occupation? Well, it's not because I think by occupying the lobby of the administration building that we will have a tremendous effect. I think rather that, you know, the movement has to have places where people can go to see the movement and to join it. And occupying, it doesn't have to be the administration building lobby, it could be another building. But what we really want to do, I think, is organize the campuses to refuse to pay student debt and to refuse to pay tuition. That would be very big. Universities are a very big part of American life now. It's not like the 1960s. Universities were much smaller then. Now there are more people working or going to school in universities than there are in manufacturing, by far. So, you know, we gotta hold on. And there's one final point I want to make. And that is this. We have a kind of childish view of movements. We think they're like fireworks, that they explode, and then the little stars in the sky drift away and down to the ground. No real human movement has ever been like that. Movements are, they erupt here, then nothing happens. And then here, and then here. And then there's a period of quiet. And then the movement wells up again. It's just, they're very irregular in their pattern. It's, when you look back on them, you imagine them like this. But no great movement ever took that form. So Stick it out. We need a big movement. We need it desperately. Our country, our lives, and maybe the planet, I think, depends on it. So, that's what I have to say.
Can we ask a question?
Of course.
Successful movements have needed is something that's sort of taboo now is discipline. You mentioned it briefly. I'm wondering if you want to say a little bit more, because it just seems like now people don't trust leaders by and large, even though that's not totally true, of course. But, you know, how can we really get it together in a way that people will hold the line or not fight back when that's not appropriate? And,
It's hard.
and I'm sorry, and about the it's not all just the flash, like, you know, Gandhi mostly didn't do a salt march, it was more, and so I just wanted to thank you for that, making that point. Constructive engagement, I guess, on the power is really important.
Well, but all great movements try for discipline, and it's very hard. As the movement gets bigger, as it involves more people in different situations, with a different cultural experience, the effort to impose, I think you're thinking of nonviolence,
Yeah,
a nonviolent discipline will get hard. I think that we should try for it. We should try to make the movement in the main nonviolent. We should not treat every eruption, every broken window, as a terrible thing that, you know, collapse of the movement. And we should not treat everybody who breaks windows as not part of the movement. They're with us too. Let's ask them not to break windows, because we don't think that's a good tactic right now.
You know, what's the strategic benefit?
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah. Well, you know,
But how we message kind of disruptions maybe is important to work.
the civil rights movement is, of course, remembered as a nonviolent movement. And it is true that Martin Luther King was an apostle of Gandhi and believed in nonviolence. It's also the case that the SCLC, the organization that he led, tried to impose the discipline of nonviolence on its followers. They had classes in nonviolence. Its cadre were taught to endure being spat upon or having soup spilled on their heads without reacting. It was a discipline that they were trying to teach people. And that was strategically, not just tactically, strategically absolutely necessary in this movement. It was a movement of African Americans in the American apartheid South. And it was a movement that took the Jesus myth and tried to embody it. That was I don't know if it was planful, but it was certainly strategic. But at the same time, as SCLC was preaching nonviolence, the Deacons for Defense, made up of small black farmers in Mississippi particularly, small black farmers who had become farmers as a result of the cooperatives established by the Farm Security Bureau in the 1930s, one of the real left-wing agencies established under the New Deal. They had farm co-ops, interracial farm co-ops in the South, which disappeared, of course. But remember I said movements leave accomplishments in their wake. And one of the accomplishments of the Farm Security Bureau was that there were all these small black farmers who had land. Those farmers were radicals. They remembered the New Deal. They remembered the ideology of cooperation that had been preached by these Farm Security Bureau experiments. Anyway, they took up arms in defense of the civil rights movement. That was also part of the movement. So, nobody today would say that SCLC or SNCC or the civil rights movement as a whole should have denounced the Deacons for Defense. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. Just with your wealth of knowledge about American history and movements like this, you mentioned a few things. I mean, in terms of building alliances with labor and building alliances. I mean, and talking about foreclosure and trying to build these connections. Are there tactics you can see towards those ends? Because they're beyond like, I mean, my engagement has just been like personal, like getting to know people on my block in my neighborhood, and like starting really slow, and just to try to build like personal relationships with people that I live near, and I think that's been helpful so far, kind of like in having a meaningful conversation as opposed to like an imposing one. I don't know how to like.
Well, that's
build
good,
that from there.
but it would also be good. There's an occupation in East New York now. To try to find out if more occupations are planned. And, oh, thank you so much. You are a very observant person. I mean, I think it's worth finding other people who also want to be part of the movement and doing it together. Are they afraid of me?
Reading your work and seeing you, and it's like a lot of fierceness comes across, and it's the most, really very strong defense of any tactic to achieve positive change. But you also speak, you never seem to speak about revolution. It's reform, conciliation, achieving what you can achieve at any given moment. And in OWS, there's a lot of people talking about revolution versus reform. Could you speak about that? Like, is it, the place of hoping for revolution, or?
Well, I think you have to engage in almost revolutionary strategies to achieve reform. On the one hand. On the other hand, I don't think that we are in, well, I'll speak for myself. I can't figure out how to make a revolution and to guarantee that the result of the revolution is, in fact, humanizing reforms. What happens, I mean, I don't know what a revolution would look like in the United States. I mean, sometimes I look at Newt Gingrich and I think, this tubby little guy, he looks to me like a fascist revolutionary. And he doesn't talk that way exactly, but he looks that way. But I'm very uncertain about either how to make a revolution or how to make a revolution that will produce the kinds of changes that I and I think many other people desire. I don't know how to do that. So my view is that let's push as hard as we can for the transforming reforms that we can understand and that seem at least possible as a result of our movement. And if the system can concede those reforms, there'll be no revolution. If it can't concede those reforms, then of course there'll be a lot of instability, and we don't know what will happen. I worry about that, but I'm willing to take that chance. Yes.
Yeah, I spend a bit of time talking to other people who are, I don't know, not in the movement and maybe far from the movement, trying to help them understand why I'm involved and sort of what this is all about. I don't know how effective those conversations are. I'm really curious what you might say to a reasonably intelligent 15-year-old, for example, about what's going on and what needs to happen.
Well, what's going on is that for the last 35 years, over the course of the last 35 years, the richest people in America who run the big corporations and the financial sector have been mobilizing politically to roll back the gains that have been made over American history, over the course of American history, by ordinary people. And this began in the early 1970s, and the form that it took in the early 1970s was the development of new political capacities on the part of big business. They organized peak organizations, they moved all of their PR firms to K Street in Washington, they drowned the Congress in lobbyists. How many lobbyists are there for every congressperson now? And what did they do with this political power they were building with their money? They were using money to build political power that would outweigh our voting power. What did they want? They wanted to cut taxes on the rich. They wanted to cut spending on the programs that ordinary Americans need, like Social Security, blah, blah, blah. They wanted to deregulate business so that it could treat working people in any way it wanted to, so that it could put poisons into their body through its manufacturing processes. They wanted to roll back unions because they were afraid that unions were giving them pushback on this campaign. Anyway, they've made the United States a worse place to live for all of us, and the great danger is that it will get worse and worse and worse. That's what I would say to him.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. You've spoken a lot about the United States and the history of social movements here, and to a certain degree, social movements have always had global dimensions or connections, but in the moment that we find ourselves in now, there's a particular intensity to those connections and the possibilities they enable. And I wonder if you could speak to that and sort of speak of our present as connected not only with the history of this particular nation state and the struggles that have defined it and humanized it, but actually speak more to the sort of global dimensions that this particular moment has that are perhaps different than ones in the past.
Well, there's certainly more communication. I mean, there's always been some communication. It's taken a long time, though, for ordinary people in Poland to learn about the French Revolution.
Yeah.
It took a long time. But now they know about it immediately, and it is inspirational. We all know that, and people, they borrow in a way the hope and the imagination. They also borrow a lot of tactics from each other. But I think what you're pushing for are the ways in which protest movements in Egypt can add to the leverage of protest movements in the West Bank or even in the United States. Now, Egypt and the West Bank, there may be real possibilities. It's hard to see right away for Egypt and the United States. I do think that there are such possibilities, however, but not much explore. And I'll give you an example. I'm trying to remember the details of this. COSATU, the South African unions, especially the longshoremen,